Value, Price, and Profit by Karl Marx. Part 2. Production, Wages, Profits. The address Citizen Weston read to us might have been compressed into a nutshell. All his reasonings amounted to this. If the working class forces the capitalist class to pay 5 shillings instead of 4 shillings in the shape of money wages, the capitalist will return in the shape of commodities 4 shillings worth instead of 5 shillings worth. The working class would have to pay 5 shillings for what, before the rise of wages, they bought with 4 shillings. But why is this the case? Why does the capitalist only return 4 shillings worth for 5 shillings? Because the amount of wages is fixed. But why is it fixed at 4 shillings worth of commodities? Why not at 3 or 2 or any other sum? If the limit of the amount of wages is settled by an economical law, independent alike of the will of the capitalist and the will of the working man, the first thing Citizen Weston had to do was to state that law and prove it. He ought then, moreover, to have proved that the amount of wages actually paid at every given moment always corresponds exactly to the necessary amount of wages and never deviates from it. If, on the other hand, the given limit of the amount of wages is founded on the mere will of the capitalist or the limits of his avarice, it is an arbitrary limit. There is nothing necessary in it. It may be changed by the will of the capitalist, and may, therefore, be changed against his will. Citizen Weston illustrated his theory by telling you that a bowl contains a certain quantity of soup to be eaten by a certain number of persons. An increase in the broadness of the spoons would produce no increase in the amount of soup. He must allow me to find this illustration rather spoony. It reminded me somewhat of the simile employed by Maenius Agrippa. When the Roman plebeians struck against the Roman patricians, the patrician Agrippa told them that the patrician belly fed the plebeian members of the body politic. Agrippa failed to show that you feed the members of one man by filling the belly of another. Citizen Weston, on his part, has forgotten that the bowl from which the workmen eat is filled with the whole produce of national labor, and that what prevents them fetching more out of it is neither the narrowness of the bowl, nor the scantiness of its contents, but only the smallness of their spoons. By what contrivance is the capitalist enabled to return 4 shillings worth for 5 shillings? By raising the price of the commodity he sells. Now, does a rise, and more generally a change in the prices of commodities, do the prices of commodities themselves depend on the mere will of the capitalist? Or are, on the contrary, certain circumstances wanted to give effect to that will? If not, the ups and downs, the incessant fluctuations of market prices become an insoluble riddle. As we suppose that no change whatever has taken place either in the productive powers of labor, or in the amount of capital and labor employed, or in the value of the money wherein the values of products are estimated, but only a change in the rate of wages, how could that rise of wages affect the price of commodities? Only by affecting the actual proportion between the demand for and the supply of these commodities. It is perfectly true that, considered as a whole, the working class spends, and must spend, its income upon necessaries. A general rise in the rate of wages would, therefore, produce a rise in the demand for, and consequently, in the market prices of necessaries. The capitalists who produce these necessaries would be compensated for their risen wages by the rising market of their commodities. But how with the other capitalists who do not produce necessaries? And you must not fancy them a small body. If you consider that 2/3 of the national produce are consumed by 1/5 of the population, a member of the House of Commons stated it recently to be but 1/7 of the population, you will understand what an immense proportion of the national produce must be produced in the shape of luxuries or be exchanged for luxuries, and what an immense amount of the necessaries themselves must be wasted upon flunkies, horses, cats, and so forth, a waste we know from experience to become always much limited with the rising prices of necessaries. Well, what would be the position of those capitalists who do not produce necessaries? For the fall in the rate of profit, consequent upon the general rise of wages, they could not compensate themselves by a rise in the price of their commodities, because the demand for those commodities would not have increased. Their income would have decreased, and from this decreased income, they would have to pay more for the same amount of higher-priced necessaries. But this would not be all. As their income had diminished, they would have less to spend upon luxuries, and therefore their mutual demand for their respective commodities would diminish. Consequent upon this diminished demand, the prices of their commodities would fall. In these branches of industry, therefore, the rate of profit would fall, not only in simple proportion to the general rise in the rate of wages, but in the compound ratio of the general rise of wages, the rise in the prices of necessaries, and the fall in the prices of luxuries. What would be the consequence of this difference in the rates of profit for capitals employed in the different branches of industry? Why, the consequence that generally obtains whenever, from whatever reason, the average rate of profit comes to differ in different spheres of production. Capital and labor would be transferred from the less remunerative to the more remunerative branches, and this process of transfer would go on until the supply in the one department of industry would have risen proportionately to the increased demand and would have sunk in other departments according to the decreased demand. This change effected, the general rate of profit would again be equalized in the different branches. As the whole derangement originally arose from a mere change in the proportion of the demand for and the supply of different commodities, the cost ceasing, the effect would cease, and prices would return to their former level and equilibrium. Instead of being limited to some branches of industry, the fall in the rate of profit consequent upon the rise of wages would have become general. According to our supposition, there would have taken place no change in the productive powers of labor, nor in the aggregate amount of production, but that given amount of production would have changed its form. A greater part of the produce would exist in the shape of necessaries, a lesser part in the shape of luxuries, or what comes to the same, a lesser part would be exchanged for foreign luxuries and be consumed in its original form, or what again comes to the same, a greater part of the native produce would be exchanged for foreign necessaries instead of for luxuries. The general rise in the rate of wages would, therefore, after a temporary disturbance of market prices, only result in a general fall of the rate of profit without any permanent change in the prices of commodities. If I am told that in the previous argument I assumed the whole surplus wages to be spent upon necessaries, I answer that I have made the supposition most advantageous to the opinion of Citizen Weston. If the surplus wages were spent upon articles formerly not entering into the consumption of the workingmen, the real increase of their purchasing power would need no proof. Being, however, only derived from an advance of wages, that increase of their purchasing power must exactly correspond to the decrease of the purchasing power of the capitalists. The aggregate demand for commodities would therefore not increase, but the constituent parts of that demand would change. The increasing demand on the one side would be counterbalanced by a decreased demand on the other side. Thus, the aggregate demand remaining stationary, no change whatever could take place in the market prices of commodities. You arrive, therefore, at this dilemma. Either the surplus wages are equally spent upon all articles of consumption, then the expansion of demand on the part of the working class must be compensated by the contraction of demand on the part of the capitalist class, or the surplus wages are only spent upon some articles whose market prices will temporarily rise. The consequent rise in the rate of profit in some, and the consequent fall in the rate of profit in other branches of industry will produce a change in the distribution of capital and labor, going on until the supply is brought up to the increased demand in the one department of industry and brought down to the diminished demand in the other departments of industry. On the one supposition, there will occur no change in the prices of commodities. On the other supposition, after some fluctuation of market prices, the exchangeable values of commodities will subside to the former level. On both suppositions, the general rise in the rate of wages will ultimately result in nothing else. To stir up your powers of imagination, Citizen Weston requested you to think of the difficulties which a general rise of English agricultural wages from 9 shillings to 18 shillings would produce. Think, he exclaimed, of the immense rise in the demand for necessaries and the consequent fearful rise in their prices. Now, all of you know that the average wages of the American agricultural laborer amount to more than double that of the English agricultural laborer, although the prices of agricultural produce are lower in the United States than in the United Kingdom, although the general relations of capital and labor obtain in the United States the same as in England, and although the annual amount of production is much smaller in the United States than in England. Why then does our friend ring this alarm bell? Simply to shift the real question before us. A sudden rise of wages from 9 shillings to 18 shillings would be a sudden rise to the amount of 100%. Now, we are not at all discussing the question whether the general rate of wages in England could be suddenly increased by 100%. We have nothing at all to do with the magnitude of the rise, which in every practical instance must depend on and be suited to given circumstances. We have only to inquire how a general rise in the rate of wages, even if restricted to 1%, will act. Dismissing friend Weston's fancy rise of 100%, I propose calling your attention to the real rise of wages that took place in Great Britain from 1849 to 1859. You are all aware of the 10 hours bill, or rather 10.5 hours bill, introduced since 1848. This was one of the greatest economical changes we have witnessed. It was a sudden and compulsory rise of wages, not in some local trades, but in the leading industrial branches by which England sways the markets of the world. It was a rise of wages under circumstances singularly unpropitious. Dr. Urey, Professor Senior, and all the other official economical mouthpieces of the middle class proved, and I must say upon much stronger grounds than those of our friend Weston, that it would sound the death knell of English industry. They proved that it not only amounted to a simple rise of wages, but to a rise of wages initiated by, and based upon, a diminution of the quantity of labor employed. They asserted that the 12th hour you wanted to take from the capitalist was exactly the only hour from which he derived his profit. They threatened a decrease of accumulation, rise of prices, loss of markets, stinting of production, consequent reaction upon wages, ultimate ruin. In fact, they declared Maximilien Robespierre's maximum laws to be a small affair compared to it, and they were right in a certain sense. Well, what was the result? A rise in the money wages of the factory operatives, despite the curtailing of the working day, a great increase in the number of factory hands employed, a continuous fall in the prices of their products, a marvelous development in the productive powers of their labor, an unheard-of progressive expansion of the markets for their commodities. In Manchester, at the meeting in 1860 of the Society for the Advancement of Science, I myself heard Mr. Newman confess that he, Dr. Urey, Senior, and all the other official propounders of economical science had been wrong, while the instinct of the people had been right. I mention Mr. W. Newman, not Professor Francis Newman, because he occupies an eminent position in economical science as the contributor to, and editor of, Mr. Thomas Tooke's History of Prices, that magnificent work which traces the history of prices from 1793 to 1856. If our friend Weston's fixed idea of a fixed amount of wages, a fixed amount of production, a fixed degree of the productive power of labor, a fixed and permanent will of the capitalist, and all his other fixedness and finality were correct, Professor Senior's woeful forebodings would have been right, and Robert Owen, who already in 1816 proclaimed a general limitation of the working day the first preparatory step to the emancipation of the working class, and actually in the teeth of the general prejudice inaugurated it, on his own hook, in his cotton factory at New Lanark, would have been wrong. In the very same period during which the introduction of the 10 hours bill, and the rise of wages consequent upon it occurred, there took place in Great Britain, for reasons which it would be out of place to enumerate here, a general rise in agricultural wages. Although it is not required for my immediate purpose, in order not to mislead you, I shall make some preliminary remarks. If a man got 2 shillings weekly wages, and if his wages rose to 4 shillings, the rate of wages would have risen by 100%. This would seem a very magnificent thing if expressed as a rise in the rate of wages, although the actual amount of wages, 4 shillings weekly, would still remain a wretchedly small, a starvation pittance. You must not, therefore, allow yourselves to be carried away by the high-sounding percents and rate of wages. You must always ask, what was the original amount? Moreover, you will understand that if there were 10 men receiving each 2 shillings per week, 5 men receiving each 5 shillings, and 5 men receiving 11 shillings weekly, the 20 men together would receive 100 shillings, or £5, weekly. If then a rise, say by 20%, upon the aggregate sum of their weekly wages took place, there would be an advance from £5 to £6. Taking the average, we might say that the general rate of wages had risen by 20%, although in fact, the wages of the 10 men had remained stationary, the wages of one lot of 5 men had risen from 5 to 6 shillings only, and the wages of the other lot of 5 from 55 shillings to 70 shillings. One half of the men would not have improved at all their position, 1/4 would have improved it in an imperceptible degree, and only 1/4 would have bettered it really. Still, reckoning by the average, the total amount of wages of those 20 men would have increased by 25%, and as far as the aggregate capital that employs them, and the prices of commodities they produce are concerned, it would be exactly the same as if all of them had equally shared in the average rise of wages. In the case of agricultural labor, the standard wages being very different in the different counties of England and Scotland, the rise affected them very unequally. Lastly, during the period when that rise of wages took place, counteracting influences were at work, such as new taxes consequent upon the Russian War, the extensive demolition of the dwelling houses of agricultural laborers, and so forth. Having premised so much, I proceed to state that from 1849 to 1859, there took place a rise of about 40% in the average rate of the agricultural wages of Great Britain. I could give you ample details in proof of my assertion, but for the present purpose, think it sufficient to refer you to the conscientious and critical paper read in 1860 by the late Mr. John C. Morton at the London Society of Arts on, quote, the forces used in agriculture. Mr. Morton gives the returns, from bills and other authentic documents, which he had collected from about 100 farmers residing in 12 Scotch and 35 English counties. According to our friend Weston's opinion, and taken together with a simultaneous rise in the wages of the factory operatives, there ought to have occurred a tremendous rise in the prices of agricultural produce during the period 1849 to 1859. But what is the fact? Despite the Russian War and the consecutive unfavorable harvests from 1854 to 1856, the average price of wheat, which is the leading agricultural produce of England, fell from about £3 per quarter for the years 1838 to 1848 to about £2 10 shillings per quarter for the years 1849 to 1859. This constitutes a fall in the price of wheat of more than 16%, simultaneously with an average rise of agricultural wages of 40%. During the same period, if we compare its end with its beginning, 1859 with 1849, there was a decrease of official pauperism from 934,419 to 860,470, the difference being 73,949, a very small decrease, I grant, and which in the following years was again lost, but still a decrease. It might be said that, consequent upon the abolition of the Corn Laws, the import of foreign corn was more than doubled during the period from 1849 to 1859, as compared with the period from 1838 to 1848. And what of that? From Citizen Weston's standpoint, one would have expected that this sudden, immense, and continuously increasing demand upon foreign markets must have sent up the prices of agricultural produce there to a frightful height, the effect of increased demand remaining the same, whether it comes from without or from within. What was the fact? Apart from some years of failing harvests, during all this period the ruinous fall in the price of corn formed a standing theme of declamation in France. The Americans were again and again compelled to burn their surplus produce, and Russia, if we are to believe Mr. Urquhart, prompted the Civil War in the United States because her agricultural exports were crippled by the Yankee competition in the markets of Europe. Reduced to its abstract form, Citizen Weston's argument would come to this. Every rise in demand occurs always on the basis of a given amount of production. It can, therefore, never increase the supply of the articles demanded, but can only enhance their money prices. Now, the most common observation shows that an increased demand will, in some instances, leave the market prices of commodities altogether unchanged, and will, in other instances, cause a temporary rise of market prices followed by an increased supply, followed by a reduction of prices to their original level, and in many cases below their original level. Whether the rise of demand springs from surplus wages or from any other cause does not at all change the conditions of the problem. From Citizen Weston's standpoint, the general phenomenon was as difficult to explain as the phenomenon occurring under the exceptional circumstances of a rise of wages. His argument had, therefore, no particular bearing whatever upon the subject we treat. It only expressed his perplexity at accounting for the laws by which an increase of demand produces an increase of supply instead of an ultimate rise of market prices. You have reached the end of Value, Price, and Profit, Part 2, Production, Wages, Profits, by Karl Marx. Click on the link at the end of the video to go to the playlist or the next chapter if it's available. If you enjoy this content and would like to support the channel, please like and subscribe.